Well, hello. This is Wade Frazier. Um, Time for another post, time for another video. Um, so my work, one of the reasons for all these videos is to try to bridge the reality gap to a degree between the people I seek and my experiences and my work, because it's so alien to most people. Um, and my work covers a bewildering array of topics. And not only because it's comprehensive in nature, but also because my journey was so wild. And Dennis Lee's journey was wilder than mine, far wilder. That Brian O'Leary's in ways was wilder than mine. So, wild journeys, comprehensive, vast array of topics, and so it presents challenges for me to present it. How do I organize it to present it in a way that doesn't overwhelm my readers and watchers and listeners? So remains to be seen how successful this will be. I think though for the people I'm seeking, this will be helpful for them. That's why I do it. Um, so I wasn't sure at this point. I started a medical racket series, which I will continue. I did a spook series, which I will continue. But they were also triggered by also the chronological posts about my journey and what I learned. And so anyway, there is a method to my madness, but it definitely can seem to wander around. Um, so and I decided though, because it's about the spook stuff, overlapped it, where I want to cover the next part of the chronological journey, which is my second stint with Dennis. And this will take a few posts. And it really, the second stint with Dennis permanently cured me of thinking that the businessman's approach to free energy would work, or that inventors are really a key. Even reliable allies, they aren't. Yeah, inventors are a small and unreliable piece of the puzzle, and the businessman's path in this world doesn't have a chance. And those were my big takeaways from my journeys with Dennis. And my second stint with Dennis arguably began when he got out of prison in '94. I think I've covered this. I think I have. Where when he got out of prison in '94, I bought his plane ticket back again. His wife and children had moved to New Jersey by that time. In fact, that saved Dennis from going to prison again because the Ventura County officials were trying to get Dennis to serve his parole in Ventura County, or they would certainly fabricate a violation of his parole and put him right back behind bars. That was their plan, and once again, Dennis's wife saved him. So they moved to New Jersey soon after, probably in '91 would be my guess. In fact, Dennis still lives there, and so they moved to New Jersey, and that was and Dennis was able to serve his parole in New Jersey, so he didn't have to go back to California at all. And then anyway, I had the plane stop for a couple hours there in Columbus, Ohio, where I worked at the time, and I spent a couple hours listening to Dennis talk about his days in prison and how we almost got murdered in there, and how the officials put him in position to be murdered multiple times. And that was kangaroo in prison and murder in prison. That was a game plan. Dennis, once again, escaped that fate. And so actually in '94, my career was actually one of the most satisfying chapters of my career was that year. Actually, I was a trucking company controller, and 3 years in, I had it running pretty well. Yeah, I was down to working maybe only 50 hours a week in those days. So anyway, it was yeah, life was good for me in Ohio. Um, but our my parent company initiated a huge system conversion to an updated version of the software they used, and it was terrible software. It was for the trucking industry, and I had made many working with the programmers, IT department. I had made many modifications over the years, and I lost them all with the conversion. And anyway, the next 2 years wiped me out. I had my fourth stress breakdown. I've been training my protege to take over my job for about 3 years at that time. And my wife was graduating with her doctorate around that time, working to get her license. And we weren't going to live in Ohio forever, no matter how pleasant those years were for me. So I truly loved living in Ohio. I really enjoyed it. It had mountains. I could have stayed. My wife didn't want to stay there, the winters and the culture and stuff, so she didn't want to. But I thought it was, yeah, I love living in Ohio. Good years for me. Um, and then in '95, Dennis visited me. Um, as he was beginning to start things up again. And so he had a trailer. He was hauling some equipment around. He was on his way to Cleveland, maybe, or something. And so, and then early '96, Dennis started barnstorming the country. In fact, just as Brian, at the same time that Brian O'Leary was beginning his rise of public free energy. And I think, as I've written before, talked about it, Brian called me one day to introduce him to Dennis because they were speaking at the same whole New Age Expo. And so they did. They met, and um, and then in February of '96, just as I was going on Prozac, yeah, I was totally one. It was the fourth stress breakdown of my career. They just, yeah, corporate America just chews you up and spits you out. And Dennis's show came through Columbus, and actually I took my protege with me, and we attended. And I was expecting maybe 30 people to attend, just like about 30 people attended for Dennis and our first greatest energy show on earth back in '87 in Boston. Except there were 300 people there, including an Amish contingent, which I'll go to my grave smiling thinking about that. All these Amish people there. And then soon afterward, Dennis actually his wife. So she flew me to New Jersey one weekend to help her, advise her on setting up their accounting system as they were flying high again. But again, I saw her. I hadn't seen her. I hadn't seen their daughters for what was that? 6 years. I hadn't seen their daughters for 6 years. They were growing up fast, and that was good. Seeing their daughters, etc. So anyway, they had an operation in New Jersey there that was they were making waves. Dennis was making waves once again. And but in June, and yeah, I was so worn out. In June, I stepped down. I actually, after about 5 years there, I stepped down, um, started working half time, and my protege took over. But the job was so stressful that about 2 weeks into his tenure as doing my job, he almost collapsed my office one day. So in fact, he left by the end of the year. That was tough. That was a tough job. Um, and by the summer of '96, Dennis was on his second tour. So he was barnstorming the country, doing these like 40 city tours. And he did two of them that year. So he did two of them that year. And in summer of '96, he was on his second tour. And my wife and I think I dragged my brother along too. We attended a show in Cleveland. He had a show in Cleveland, and Dennis planned the tour finale for that second one to be in Philadelphia. In fact, in the stadium where the Philadelphia 76er basketball team plays basketball. So that same stadium. And by that second tour, he had actually teamed up with a guy named Yule Brown. In fact, in this post is going to be mostly about Yule. I said there's a lot to write about my second stint with Dennis and discuss, but this one's going to try to focus on Yule. Yeah, Yule. In fact, I might as well do that now. In fact, I'm going to jump around here in this post. But Yule was Bulgarian, and actually during World War II, he worked for the Nazis in Greece. He's actually ran one of the Greek islands for the Nazis in World War II. And after World War II was over, somehow he was able to go to Moscow. So he ended up going to Moscow. And he, his wife, though, his wife turned him into the KGB and ended up in Soviet gulags. In fact, he got an engineering degree, as I recall, in I think in Moscow. And anyway, he spent 6 years in Soviet gulags, and I heard lots of Yule stories in my second stint with Dennis, and one of them, and ha, like so many of the people in my journey, he shouldn't have survived the gulags. And so, in fact, one day he apparently irritated the commander of one of the camps he was in, and they had something that was a standing torture. So they put you in a box that you could only stand up in, and you'd stand there in a box for days. And the commander decided that he was going to do the standing torture for Yule, put him in this box, and the commander asked one of his underlings how long, what's the longest since somebody has survived the standing torture, and they said 3 days. And this guy said, let's give Yule a week. His name wasn't Yule then. Yule actually named himself Yule after Yul Brynner after he came to the West. But I think it was Ivan was his real first name, original name. And so anyway, so they put Yule in a box, standing box for a week, and literally, and what happens is when you stand like that, everything settles. So your lymph glands. So again, your body, your heart, and your system can't overcome gravity like that constantly for 7. So his lower body ballooned. In fact, he said that when the week was up, he couldn't get out of the box. He had filled the box, and they had to tear the box apart to get him out. And his legs bothered him for the rest of his life because of that. Yeah. So he amazingly survived the standing torture in the gulag. Anyway, so then he was after 6 years in gulags, I guess he was rehabilitated, went back to Bulgaria, but he wanted to come to the West. And he actually escaped Bulgaria by swimming the river between Bulgaria and Turkey. But once he got to the other bank, Turkey got picked up by the authorities there, and was called a spy. And he spent 5 years in Turkish prisons. And for those who have seen the Midnight Express, you get some idea what Turkish prisons were like. In fact, Yule said that the Turkish prisons were worse than the Soviet gulags, believe it or not. And when he got out of prison, when he finally got out of Turkish prison, he tried to come to the United States, tried to come to the West, and but he couldn't get it. The United States was always the plum place for people like him to go to, but he ended up getting Australia instead. So he ended up moving to Australia, and that is actually where he began his research into what became known as Brown's gas. And eventually, Yule did make it to LA after bouncing around the world, actually in China. So China built Yule a city around Brown's gas technology, and so it had 2,000 scientists in it. Again, a city devoted to Brown's gas. So China does that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, they supposedly built a free energy city, 10 years ago. Only China does stuff like that. But Yule wanted to live in the United States, understandably. And so even when he was, in fact, I heard lots of Yule stories. In fact, when he was there in China, he was the honored guest at some state dinner, with a table 50 yards long or whatever. And as the honored guest, they brought some monkey out that was playing around. And they put the monkey down. They actually cracked the top of the skull open. So Yule, again, this is honored guest stuff. They served him monkey brains, live monkey brains. And then I think Yule took one bite or two, and then let his friends share the rest of it. Yeah, that was one of the many Yule stories I heard. So, in fact, Yule became a Buddhist monk, and I don't know when he did that. Might have been during his days in China. I'm not sure. So anyway, but Yule, he kept wanting to be in the United States, understandably, and so eventually got into. Eventually, he set up shop in Southern California. And set up shop in Southern California, and he had a facility there. And again, he became famous. In fact, in my Brian O'Leary post and the one post on the energy movement, mentioned Alden Bryant, and Alden actually worked with Yule back then. So this is probably early '90s. So Yule Alden was one of the number of people who worked with Yule Brown. I run into quite a few people who worked with Yule, and anyway, so Yule was in fact, and then Berkeley Bedell. Well, actually, back up a little bit. So I've mentioned Gaston the Sands. In fact, in the medical racket stuff, I mentioned him again. Reading Christopher Bird's book on Gaston the Sands back in 1990. That was really my beginnings of my medical racket studies. I was reading that book. Especially Daisy Shane to Rife, then Ralph Benania's Medical Dark Ages, and on and on and on. And so Christopher Bird wrote that book about Nassans. In fact, during my second stay with Dennis, I actually talked to Gaston. In fact, I had about an hour-long conversation with his wife. Another story for another day. And then a guy named Berkeley Bedell, Congressman Berkeley Bedell. He and again, so in the sands, it wasn't just a microscope that could see interesting subcellular dynamics that are unrecognized by the mainstream, but he came up with a medical treatment related to that, which worked for degenerative diseases. And so Berkeley Bedell actually had prostate cancer, and actually he used the Sanders treatment and was cured. In fact, Berkeley would be 98 eventually. So he died many years after having prostate cancer because he had Nassans 714X treatment. One of Bedell, so he became kind of the alternative congressman. So he actually, in fact, once he had that happen, he actually co-founded a department of the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, for alternative medicine, alternative treatments, which that bureaucracy is so corrupt. Yeah, kind of never went anywhere. You're fighting the bureaucracy the whole time. Bureaucracy that's owned and paid for by big pharma. So yeah, you find out when you start doing that kind of stuff how the land really lies. Anyway, so Yule was down there in LA, and Bedell actually badgered the Department of Energy to look into Yule's stuff. In fact, Yule, the most maybe noteworthy aspect of Brown's gas was its apparent ability to create a low energy, what's called low energy nuclear reactions. And so he was able to take radioactive material and treat it with this Brown's gas flame and get this reaction, and the radioactivity would almost vanish. And so and this experiment's been done quite a few times. And anyway, so anyway, Bedell, he prevailed on the DOE, and they actually sent a team down from the Bay Area to Yule's facility down there, and they didn't want to be there. So apparently, these guys had their Geiger counters in hand, etc. And Yule's doing his neutralization transmutation demonstration, and when it came to where the reaction was going to happen, they tried to hide behind counters and stuff. They thought they were going to get radiated, like a demon core experience or something, which people who studied the Manhattan Project and stuff know what I'm talking about. Well, anyway, the radioactivity went down by 96%. Their own Geiger counter showed this. And the DOE guys, a couple things happened. One of them, they turned logical somersaults to try to deny what they had just witnessed, what their Geiger counters had measured. And the second thing was they went to the authorities down in Southern California and tried to get Yule's operation shut down. And then the DOE just washed their hands of it and tried to ignore it after that, which I would have a later encounter with the DOE too, which I'll get to in this post also. So anyway, so Yule was again, he was really famous. He was really, in fact, Brian O'Leary met with him. Again, in the free energy field, his name comes up, alternatives, fringe stuff. This guy was a fixture back there, particularly in the 90s. And so Dennis, during his tours, he heard so much about Yule, and so he met with Yule and was trying to recruit Yule into his effort. And again, the people around Yule down in Southern California, I interacted with them some, a really naive bunch, and they were the ones who were trying to tell Again, like Alden Bryant, that Dennis had no money, which wasn't true. And they kept trying to dissuade Yule from working with Dennis. And I don't know if that was dog in the manger or what exactly was going on there, but there was, yeah, they were wasn't a good crew down there in LA. And anyway, but Dennis met with Yule. In fact, Dennis met him. He said, "How I want to buy one of your Brown's gas machines." Again, China was building them. They sold them for a few thousand a pop, as I recall. And anyway, and Dennis met with Yule one day and he says, "Yule, I want one. I'll pay for it right now. What do you want? Cash, check, or gold?" And Yule goes, "Gold, please." And then later came out that Yule was testing Dennis to see if Dennis was full of it or not. And Dennis opens up his briefcase and counts out a stack of Krugerrands and hands them to Yule. Says, "There you go." And Dennis heard later that Yule didn't even know what to do with them. He actually gave them away as gifts to people eventually. Yeah. So anyway, but that was the beginning of their relationship. And so hey, Dennis is the real McCoy. So during the course of their Dennis's tour there, he started promoting Yule. And so, and then, and again, the second tour, it was going to end up there in Philadelphia and the Philly show. And then Yule was going to be the guest of honor at the Philly show. That was the plan. And so, and again, I was only working part time, and Dennis kept trying to get me to work for him. He'd been trying to get me to work for him for about 7 years by that time. And so I wasn't ready to walk into that hurricane. But they asked me to go there and help come over to Jersey from Ohio to help them with the Philly show. So I won't came out there. In fact, Wayne, whose health was ruined, life was ruined, dear Wayne, they had him come out also. So this is 96. This is September of 96. So Wayne comes out in New Jersey. I come out and Wayne and I are hanging out and with Dennis and Allison and the kids and all that kind of stuff. And again, Dennis had quite an organization going at that time. In fact, Dennis, before he went to prison, he was aligned with the Patriot movement. So this was when he got out, it was kind of more of the same, the Patriot movement stuff, a lot of right wingers. Not my scene, but this is Dennis though, migrant farm worker background, etc. And so this was what was going on. And so, yeah, I was really one of the only, I was a corporate America guy. I was from corporate America. I wasn't working with Dennis. And so this was, yeah, I was a different animal than most of what Dennis was used to dealing with. Um, that's another long story, but, so I came out and then, and Dennis, he wanted me to be the guy. He wanted Wayne and I to sort of host Yule when he came, and so I think it was that trip, I believe, that Dennis had a box of documentation on Yule, and so I read it. And Christopher Bird was planning to write a book about Yule. And in fact, Christopher Bird, he died before he could write that book, but he was planning on it. And he'd written a number of articles about Yule and stuff. And so anyway, so I did my homework. So I was reading up on Yule there, and then Wayne and I were going to pick him up from the Newark airport there. In fact, drove a van down to Newark airport. And in fact, we got there, so we drove all the way down to Newark, which is an hour and some. In fact, I just saw Dennis last year. I had to drive from Newark to his place again, and that was kind of a rough drive. Well, anyway, so drove all the way down to Newark at the airport, waiting for, and this is in the good old days, you could actually go to the gate right before 9/11. So anyway, we're waiting at the gate, no Yule. So we drive all the way back to Dennis's place, and we hear that Yule was paranoid that there were some people who got on the plane. He didn't like the looks of them, so he didn't get on the flight. And I saw the people coming off the plane. It's like, okay, there's a couple of long-haired, kids look like they're rock stars or something, but that was about it. Anyway, Yule was paranoid. Again, how to say it? Not all paranoia is delusional, but the last and this was an indicator of our problems we were going to have with Yule. Actually, first indicator was that. And so then it was like, oh, he's get on the plane for the next day. So anyway, so the next day, Wayne and I drive back down to Newark, the airport, get to the gate. No Yule. And so we drove all the way back to Dennis's place again. It's just as we get back, we're throwing our hands in the air, and then we get the call. Oh, he's on a different flight now. Well, Wayne just said, forget it. Wayne, you go. So anyway, so for the third time now, I drive down to Newark to pick up Yule. And I get there. In fact, I barely made it because it was like he was in the air when we got back. That he was it was in the air already. So I got back, in fact, rushed to the gate. But he wasn't at the gate, and actually I caught him at the curb. He was about ready to take a cab to a nearby motel. But I caught him just before he got into a cab. And anyway, because I saw the saw the nameplate on his satchel, it said Yule Brown. So anyway, so I picked him up, got him on the van, drove him back. And it was a pleasant drive back, and we were talking. And if I asked him about Christopher Bird, and Yule thought Chris was a good man, this kind of thing. And so we chit chatted. Then we got back, and then, it was funny. This was one of the more memorable days of my life, really. So we get back to Dennis's place, and Dennis, again, this whole transmutation demonstration, they were planning on doing it at the Philadelphia show. And in fact, they had gotten, Dennis had applied to a Nuclear Regulatory Commission for that, to have a demonstration. And they gave permission. And then just before the show, they withdrew it. They said, no, we're not going to let you do that. So anyway, that was going to be the highlight of the show. And so they're already undermining Dennis's show. And anyway, and then Dennis had some connections on the inside, and he was told that at that show would be federal marshals, and if he and Yule had tried to do the transmutation experiment, they'd be arrested. Well, Dennis was still on parole at that time, illegally, but they had him on parole. And Yule had spent 12 years in, Soviet gulags and Turkish prisons, and so they decided not to put on the demonstration. Understandably. But anyway, so we get there, though. So we get there, and again, you'll have like a suitcase and a satchel. He didn't have much luggage, but a couple things. And this bag he had, like satchel. We're at Dennis's place and at the kitchen table there in their kitchen. Yeah, they had this building that was like 5 stories tall or something, which was kind of their compound. And a bunch of people lived there. I would stay there when I would visit. And Dennis and his family lived there also. They lived on like the 4th floor or something. And in fact, we had an office on the 1st floor. Eventually became the office before they outgrew it. Anyway, so we were sitting at the kitchen table there, and Yule takes out his satchel. It's pretty big, and he sets it on the desk. And then out of some pocket he pulls out what turns out to be a Geiger counter. And so then he's actually running his Geiger counter over his bag, and also it lights up. And anyway, he opens that up, and it was a pocket. It was full of like rubber bands and stuff, and it had just this junk. It was just like this junk that was there. Well, that was Yule had smuggled aboard nuclear materials onto the plane. In fact, I'm going to give you sort of what it looked like. So you see the clear part of this. Well, the clear part of these donuts were like the clear part of this, and in the middle was something about like this. This is one of my hearing aid batteries, about that big. And so this was a piece of radioactive metal. And actually, he had 4 different samples with him. So one of them was cobalt-60. He also had americium and polonium, and I keep forgetting what the 4th one was. But anyway, so he had these 4 samples that he brought along. Yule came prepared to do the transmutation demonstration. And so anyway, it was pretty hilarious to watch Yule take these nuclear samples, radioactive samples out of his bag, which I'm sure was illegal. Okay. But anyway, so Yule was showing us that stuff, and he offered to do a demonstration for Dennis when he was there. He said, "Dennis, I'll use one of these and do a demo for you now before the show." I don't think I wasn't there for. I don't think he did it. In fact, I later saw a tape of Yule doing that. So, yeah, so interesting. Yeah, he would basically his Brown's gas was like an acetylene torch, except it was his Brown's gas instead of acetylene. He just cook basically, and he'd actually melt aluminum and other things. Yeah, so Brown's gas can melt tungsten, and so anyway, so he would melted a bunch of metals in a matrix with the radioactive sample, and then after some minutes, I don't know, half hour, 20 minutes, some number, there would be this kind of flash. It would kind of explode. And that was literally kind of, apparently it was a nuclear reaction, except it didn't blow up the building. But when the nuclear reaction was over, the radioactivity was almost entirely gone. This was the Brown's gas transmutation experiment. And so it's been performed quite a few times. And again, he performed it for the Department of Energy several years earlier. So, so we had the Philadelphia show then. So we did the Philadelphia show. And in fact, I drove home back to Ohio. In fact, it turned out I lost my job. So again, it's kind of I don't want to get too much into the story here, but basically I was only working 20 hours a week. And so I really didn't, I was still able to work 20 hours a week, but I took about 3 consecutive days off work and didn't ask the president. And he fired me while I was gone, which he ran the company into the ground. Not only took down that company, but all the parent company and sister companies at the same time with an accounting scandal of how to say it. After I left, they just went through a bunch of accountants and they stopped reconciling the most important account they had, biggest liability. And again, the systems were so terrible that every month, I had my protege beat reconcile that account, and they stopped doing it. Anyway, there was over $1 million of losses buried in that account after about 4 years. And when it got discovered, it actually took down the parent company, everything destroyed. I mean, literally thousands of lives were wrecked by that. And yeah, it was painful to watch that. Yeah, I kept in touch. I still keep in touch with people I used to work with back then. Um, so yeah, I know it's funny to lose my job. In fact, what I didn't do is I could have still squared Yule around, but I didn't. And in fact, that what happens after the Philadelphia show, Dennis, one of the guys in his network, this big guy, is like 6'5", 250 pounds, mesomorph. He became Yule's manservant and bodyguard. And in fact, the first thing they did at the Philadelphia show is they went to the White House. So they actually had a meeting with Al Gore. And Yule's there meeting at Al Gore at the White House with, again, this our manservant guy. I could have gone. I guess if I'd have wanted to, I could have gone to that. But what got to me back then was again, Yule was talking with Al Gore, Mr. Environment, right, about transmutation, nuclear waste issues, etc. And during the meeting, he mentioned that Dennis was promoting him, and one of the White House staffers said, "You better hope the president doesn't hear you say that." Yeah, so Bill Clinton was highly aware of Dennis and unhappy. Yeah, Dennis was, again, put 5,000 people in the sports stadium, talking about free energy, et cetera. Barnstorming the country. Yeah, so Dennis had attention from the White House from the 80s, probably till today, but definitely yeah, Bush, Obama, Clinton, Reagan, he had attention from the White House for many years. Um, and my when I saw Dennis there in Columbus and early, yeah, I mentioned this. I had the fourth stress breakdown in my career. Yeah, corporate America is just brutal, brutal, brutal way to live. Yeah, in fact, when I originally was an auditor in public accounting, I don't know of a guy in public accounting, a partner in public accounting who lived to age 70. And I didn't meet one. The ones I knew all died in their 50s and 60s. So that's the toll that lifestyle took. Um, so anyway, Dennis was promoting Yule big time. I mean, this is all promoting big time. And so and Dennis's big play was trying to work with the federal government, and hence the White House meeting, et cetera, use Brown's gas to neutralize nuclear waste. That was a big play. In fact, I'll get to in this post. Dennis and I eventually spoke at Department of Energy hearings about that. For me, and so it's the thing where back to the businessman's approach and stuff. Dennis is the greatest human being I will ever know, and his companies were stolen so many times. He was again behind bars twice. Shouldn't have survived. The officials are trying to get him killed by the inmates. Again, Indiana Jones. Dennis is the Indiana Jones of the free energy field, and whenever he'd start over, he'd start from nothing. And so he's almost man on the street stuff. So he'd do these populist approaches, trying to get, to build it up. So he'd sell business opportunities to people, for people who were basically not businessmen. Yeah. So, but how to say it? It would have worked if we'd have been unmolested. It definitely could have worked. And for me, though, Dennis had the rules-based heating system. And again, the tax credit was no longer there to put on people's homes for free, but still, it's still the rules-based heating system. Even to this day, there's an awesome market for it. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to build and sell equipment, and then I wanted to fund R&D from the profits. But Dennis was doing R&D from business opportunities. I didn't like that, never did. And so I got it, but I wanted to get away from that as quickly as possible, and that meant selling stuff. Again, selling equipment to the public, energy saving equipment. World's best heating system was a pretty good entree. That was my dream. That's what I wanted to do. Never got to do it. We kept getting wiped out. And so, when I was in the trucking business, again, my epiphany was how to take the company paperless. In fact, and the piggyback on top of that was there's a million people who sleep in their trucks in the United States, truck drivers, and the technology existed 30 years ago to end all that. Everybody could sleep in their own beds, and I knew how to do that. And in fact, I said before, Richard Stallman, the father of the free software movement, he was impressed with that. And again, people who are tech people, programmers, etc., their mouth waters when they see what I came up with, and it's still viable, although how to say it, piloted vehicles are probably not long for the world, you might guess. But anyway, so those were things that I was, that was my bag, and again, Dennis's, again, when I met him, he was putting the world's best heating system on people's homes for free. It's still the most benevolent and brilliant business strategy I ever saw. And Dennis never got back to that. And so, well, the tax credit wasn't there, so I got that part. But we really never pursued the heat pump again. Dennis was off chasing after free energy. And so I had really mixed feelings about that. Yeah, I wanted to sell the heat pumps and then make money off of, use the profits to fund R&D. That's what I wanted. And in Ventura, we were going for that. That was the whole thing about the kits to make, install, and sell them, et cetera. So, yeah, we still were trying to do that when we got wiped out. But after Dennis's first stint behind bars, he never really tried to do that again. And so that's really where my interest was. And Brown's gas and this kind of stuff was, kind of ancillary. And then by that time, again, I knew about Sparky Sweet stuff. I knew my friend got kidnapped for the Underground Technology Show. I knew that free energy and anti-gravity tech were on the planet. In fact, older than I am. So I knew that. By the time I joined Dennis, that second stint, I already knew those things. So for me, chasing after stuff like Brown's gas and it wasn't too exciting for me. And he had stuff like a plastic house and a novel jackhammer that didn't really ruin the operator and other stuff. But it was kind of this grab bag general store kind of thing. Again, I think trying to get momentum, and his big play was going to be trying to get involved with the nuclear waste issue with Brown's gas. I think that was it. Yeah, so welding. So Brown's gas was definitely some weird stuff. And there's been a lot of scientific research on that. And the transmutation experiment was done a lot, but it's just all kind of died, and so just like Dennis's heat pump died, and North America's been totally wiped out. So yeah, the innovations can die like that. I've just seen this now repeatedly. This stuff can just die because it's not wanted. by certain interests. And again, it's just so hard anyway. Even if there was an organized suppression, it's just so hard to make new stuff happen. Yeah. Bringing exotic technology and disruptive technology to the marketplace is never easy, even aside from organized suppression. So, Yule, Dennis actually bought Yule a hotel room there at a resort nearby there in Jersey, and Yule didn't stay there. So this manservant bodyguard guy who worked with Dennis for several years till he betrayed him. Till yeah, Dennis almost everybody betrays Dennis in the end. Uh, yeah. So, but this guy was his again his manservant bodyguard. In fact, at the Philly show. Again, Yule is a centerpiece, and Yule got a standing ovation from 5,000 people. In fact, if you watch the footage, you can see me. So that show, you can see me up there doing the standing ovation. Had a beard at the time, and yeah, I wasn't working full time. I wasn't working full time. Grew a beard again for a while. And uh, let's say about that. Let me put this on hold for just a second. So you'll get a standing ovation from 5,000 people there in that sports stadium, and again, his manservant bodyguard. You remember he told me later that every day they had a VCR and a VCR with them on the road, and every day Yule would watch that standing ovation. Yeah, I guess Yule thought that was the crowning moment of his life, getting that standing ovation like that. So anyway, Yule, and so there was this hotel room that Dennis bought for Yule. And again, when I went back and lost my job, I actually asked them that I could start in November. Because again, it was, I had a wife. My brother was living with us. I had to get everything settled down. And so, in fact, my brother, he never left the Midwest. My wife ended up going to Alameda, California to help with her sister who had twins for several months. And I ended up going to New Jersey to be with Dennis. And anyway, so and I spent a month. I spent the month of October. In fact, my mother visited me. First time I've seen her in several years. Back when kind of patched it up. And my brother was there, so my mother spent a week with us there in October, and I was writing. I was busy making my first website. I wrote 400 pages in a month, and 50 pages in a day, along with 200 pages I'd written earlier, such as my Ralph Hogmanian's Medical Dark Ages quotes. Published it there at the end of October, and then went to work for Dennis. And when I got there, when I went to my first stint there with Dennis, I was there a couple of weeks, and I went back and then put most of my household in storage. My wife left for the West Coast, and then I took most of our household there to New Jersey with our two cats. Oh my, yeah, it was good thing I was young. That was pretty tough. Anyway, I showed up there, but the first time I actually, Dennis put me up in a hotel room he had bought for Yule. So Yule didn't stay there. In fact, Yule never stayed there. So after that Philly show, he never came back to New Jersey, and he was bouncing around the United States. And Dennis, and again, it was like, what the hell is he doing? And so Yule just Dennis bought like $1 million of Brown's gas machines, paid Yule $250,000 commission for those Brown's gas machines, and Yule just kept sort of playing hard to get, kind of, and it was odd. And so anyway, so I came to work there, and I got more ports coming, so that whole strange, yeah, there were some surreal aspects of my second stint with Dennis, which I will get into in future posts. But anyway, Mule just kept bouncing around the country again and we're paying for it, and we have this manservant, waiting on him hand and foot, etc. And so they said, took him to the White House. Again, I think he was in California for a while, but literally it was like he was just sort of like touring the United States kind of thing. It was really odd, really odd. And Dennis, though, he was hot to make something happen with Brown's gas, and and also once again, as a parade of inventors came through, like the inventor, like I said, this was Dennis, and Dennis was the inventor's best friend. Inventors weren't Dennis's best friend though, so yeah, most inventors would take the money and run. They didn't have anything, and this kind of stuff. And in fact, Dennis Ventura, my mentor. I mean, my mentor was a Tesla level technical inventive talent. And after Ventura, Dennis never had that again. So Dennis would, see inventors and say, "Hey, I want your stuff," but Dennis didn't know if it worked or not. And quite often it didn't. But yeah, Dennis blew a lot of money on inventors who didn't deliver anything. And that's a legitimate criticism of what Dennis is doing. But again, we lost so much from Ventura, and that's why we were so dangerous. That's why they took us out the way they did, because in Ventura we were dangerous, particularly with Sparky Sweet down the road. Um, and Yeah, so Dennis never had that talent again. In fact, and this is what my mentor used to tell me. It's like very few like engineers have any real creative ability. So they're just kind of I call them plotters, and only about 1% of engineers or so. And this is typical in the technical field, have really much creative ability. In fact, Bucky Fuller thought that only 1 in 100,000 would have to be that genius who would keep advancing humanity's technology. Of course, Bucky didn't account for organized suppression in that. And anyway, yeah, Dennis he's like Hughes higher than mine, but it's he's not a scientist. And so this was yeah, Dennis, he did the best he could, but he was really in over his head with inventors a lot. And yeah, and they all ended up disappointing him, betraying him, this kind of stuff, stealing from him, on and on. And so and because Dennis started from nothing. And again, I'm sort of skipping around in this in my accompanying post. Um, Again, when he had started from nothing, again, his populist approach. Again, partly because he was a migrant farm worker, but partly his he drank so much American Kool-Aid, etc. He would try for these populist approaches. And again, he's starting the small time. And so he attracted the unsophisticated, the greedy gangsters, all this kind of stuff. And then he tried to survive that. Yeah, surviving your business associates is the hard part. As I said, they're constantly trying to steal the company. Then survive numerous murder attempts, all that three-ring circus. And what I realized though, and this was for me, it was I just I couldn't articulate it for a long time. And I've been studying for years, but again, I had a lot more years of study ahead of me before I really could articulate what I was seeing. And what it was Dennis was appealing to the three basic population management ideologies in the United States, which is nationalism, capitalism, organized religion. And what that's going to do is it's going to attract people of self-serving motivation, because all of those create their in-group ideologies, which create in-groups as expensive out-groups. And again, this is what social animals do. But that kind of ideological adherence really short circuits people's ability to think. And in fact, materialism, rationalism, and scientism are also the ideological traps of mainstream scientists. Yeah, so very few people can think beyond the box of the ideological box they were indoctrinated into. Very few people on Earth are able to do that. I need people who can, but they're very rare. And so, I eventually realized that for the biggest event in the human journey, which is the arrival of free energy, anti-gravity is a bonus. All the other tech my friend saw is a bonus. Just give me free energy, and I'll give you the fifth epoch. Um, I realize that an effort has to aim far higher than business opportunities and religious orientation and nationalist orientation, all that. No, it's in fact, those are the population management tools of the elites. And I don't think you're going to outmaneuver them with their own tools managing the herd. Yeah, I can't. What I'm doing, it can't be people who are acting like herd members. They have to be sentient beings. Again, back to disillusioned idealists. And so I hadn't articulated that at that time, but I just remember just going, I don't think it's going to work. I was like, this isn't going to work. In fact, it definitely affected my attitude, and so it didn't work out with Dennis in my second stint. And this was partly why. Also, I was worn out. I shouldn't have signed up. And Dennis kept working at me for all these years to come back with him again. In fact, he tried again 10 years later. No thanks. But anyway, so even then, I was really thinking what would work. Again, I already knew these technologies were real. So how can these technologies be developed and brought to the world? So I've been on this one for 40 years now. And so anyway, uh, uh, this was going through my head when I was with Dennis that time. And Neil Brown's antics were nearly the last for me as far as mutant inventors, because I eventually realized that the inventors aren't the answer. They're not. In fact, the arrested development that the free energy field's in. It's partly because that focused on inventors. They're a dime a dozen, and so yeah, it's like I don't. They're not the answer. And what Yule Brown did was one of my almost my last instance, right? I really said, yeah, inventors are not the key to this at all. And again, my company post, I link to papers and stuff around transmuting nuclear waste. Brown's gas isn't the only one that's been said to do it. I said I saw a tape of you doing it, all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, again, it'd be nice to see, it'd be nice if the DOE picked up the ball that was placed in their lap back in '92 instead of running the other way as fast as they could. So, yeah, they're aware of it. So this is the thing that's like frustrating. Again, the medical racket, energy racket, all again, this is typical bureaucratic inertia. And yeah, so it's how it is. Um, and anyway, so went to work for Dennis, and he was trying to make things happen again with he wasn't selling much product at that time. Yeah, again, we weren't selling the heat pump. We weren't none of that. None of that was happening. And again, his play was Brown's gas machines, some other stuff, but Brown's gas machines. He's selling books. But again, I think Dennis's big play was trying to get in cahoots with the federal government to pursue Brown's gas technology. Again, particularly for nuclear waste management. But there's other applications. So yeah, so definitely Brown's gas has again, there's a market for this stuff. If you can break in, that's part of the problem. Um, so and when I was with Dennis, he told me about a guy. In fact, I linked to it when I discussed my days with the new energy movement and Brian, this guy called Mr. Copycat who copied Yule's work. He just copied the stuff. In fact, he copied Dennis's heat pump stuff. So this guy, I call him Mr. Copycat. So Dennis, I remember then Dennis told me about this guy who, as Dennis is trying to make something happen with Yule, this guy was out there copying Brown's gas stuff, selling Brown's gas machines, et cetera, that he's making himself. And really, and Dennis is like, is this guy's job to take the wind out of my sails? Good question. Again, we have that guy, Mr. Copcat, and I have people in common. And I was eventually told that he was just probably another greedy guy. He was just trying to make money and being greedy. So again, and sailing Dennis. And again, this guy never paid Yule a dime, but he berated Dennis for his treatment of Yule, which was again, I said when I saw that I was just another creep. I was like, yeah, that guy never helped you. And so it's a thing where Dennis helped you big time. You did not return the favor. Um, and so in February, I think it was might have been March. I think it was February '97. So there is in fact, this is going to be near the end of my story with Yule. So there's a thing. So nuclear waste is a problem. And so particularly spent nuclear fuel, definitely it's a big problem. In fact, at this point, the geniuses who run the nuclear establishment decided we're just going to bury it in the ground and hopefully it doesn't come up for 250,000 years. This is kind of the so-called solution. And anyway, and there was, and again, the high grade nuclear waste. In fact, they gerrymandered a county. It was called Bullfrog County, Nevada, to where they're going to put all the high, again, the really dangerous nuclear waste. You're going to put it there. And by knowledge, I don't think it ever happened. So I'm still not. Yeah, the nuclear waste problem is still a festering thing. And but they also had an issue of all of it contaminated everything that touched, and so there was also a secondary nuclear waste contamination of the equipment, etc. And so this low grade stuff, there was a thing called, in fact, it's called the WIPP. WIPP was the acronym, and it was basically some salt caverns in New Mexico they finally picked to basically put all the contaminated stuff in this salt cavern. And again, leave it down there for hopefully for 250,000 years. Nobody goes down there again, so then it'll be safe in 250,000 years, kind of thing. That's the answer. Well, anyway, so we were, and then there were actually being a federal government supposedly supposed to ask for the public's input. Well, there was actually a traveling series of hearings, Department of Energy hearings about the WIPP and what to do about it, open to the public. And so anyway, so the Savannah facility down in South Carolina in February '97, they actually had hearings there on the WIPP, what to do about this. Anyway, so Dennis, he he said he's gonna, and I volunteered. I said, I'll go down. All right, Dennis decided to go down with me. And so we went down. We took a road trip down to South Carolina together. In fact, and Dennis being a paraplegic, I remember I had to push him through a wheelchair through the miles. The Atlanta airport is the biggest airport I've ever been in, I think. And so it was, I pushed Dennis for a mile or so through the Atlanta airport. And then we actually flew into Augusta, which only the week of the Masters doesn't have much traffic. And so we stopped at Augusta and then we drove to the Savannah facility where these hearings are going to be held. And that was a company town, so literally the street right where this building was for the hearings is called Atomic Road. Yeah, when I saw that, I was like, man, this is a company town, all right. So anyway, so Dennis and we spoke at these Department of Energy hearings. They were sparsely attended. I bet there weren't 50 people there. Mostly there were contractors planning to make some money off it, et cetera. And then anyway, Dennis and I tag teamed it. There were hearings in the morning and the afternoon. And so we spoke at both. And so, and I went first and Dennis went second. So I was like the facts guy. So I just laid out a lot of the information around Brown's gas. And then Dennis followed me, putting on a salesman's hat. And anyway, the guy who held the hearings he was like probably 40-ish. Yeah, I imagine he's retired by now. But anyway, he's like, 40 years old or something. And he was a Boy Scout. And I've seen him. I've run into these guys. The CIA even has them. DOE, EPA. You get these guys who work for the government, believe in the cause. They're kind of Boy Scouts. Well, the guy around the hearings kind of was a Boy Scout. And anyway, in the end, it was a morning hearing and afternoon hearing, and there was a lunch break. So at the lunch break, Dennis and I go out to our rent-a-car and about ready to go find somewhere to eat. And the guy who ran the hearings actually followed us out to our car. And I was driving, so he comes up to the passenger side, and Dennis rolls down the window. And this guy, he said, we were the third group that had appeared at these hearings. They were traveling around the United States. We were the third group that had proposed a neutralization solution to the nuclear waste problem. And he handed us his card, and he said he was an underling, and that he didn't have much pull, but he would do what he could at the DOE to get interest. And then he said something I'll never forget. He said, there are people who stand to make a lot of money managing nuclear waste. And if your answer doesn't make them a lot of money, not going anywhere. Yeah. This is the guy who ran the hearings. So basically, he was confessing that nuclear waste management was a racket. Not terribly surprising, I suppose. So anyway, that was a moment. He was trying to wise us up to what we were really getting into. And so anyway, so we had the hearings and went home, went back, and in fact, a couple weeks later, we actually got a phone call from the DOE, and they were like, "Hey, we heard about this," and anyway, there was a book published about the hearings. In fact, I'm in it. In fact, I published that on my site. In the link here, you can to this post, you can see where the book names me as speaking at these hearings with Dennis. And anyway, they just basically said, well, what you're proposing is there's no peer-reviewed literature on that. So we really can't support it. Well, haha, so there's no peer-reviewed literature because the DOE actually saw it and then tried to make like it didn't happen. Yeah, so it's funny, the right arm and the left arm of the DOE, not working in unison, or maybe they were. Yeah, so it's kind of ironic to get that response from the DOE because their own guys saw it with Geiger counters in hand. And then about a week or two later, this is about the end for me. So I left the operation end of March of 1997. Went home. Dennis, I got to go home. Yeah, it didn't work. It didn't work out for me with Dennis, and there was a number of reasons for that. But in the end, I guess I was hoping we were going to do something else, really, and we didn't. But Dennis, again, I live only a few minutes from the office. We were living in the hinterlands there of New Jersey. Vernon, New Jersey, is where we were headquartered, and anyway, so Dennis came to my house one day and picked me up to go to work. And again, Dennis made recordings of all his phone calls in those days for good reason. And he played me a tape of him in a call with Yule. And this tape lasted for like maybe 45 minutes, half hour, 45 minutes, it was something like that. It was more than a half hour, somewhere between a half hour and 45 minutes. And what it was the Brown's gas machines. In fact, we sent a tech to China, to their city in China, to help us with technical issues. In fact, China sent a team out to us there in New Jersey, helping us with the Brown's gas machines. And on the phone call with Yule, Dennis was saying, well, Yule, some of the applications that have been, promoted to me, some of the welding applications and stuff, it doesn't really seem to work that well. And so anyway, so this phone call was mostly just Dennis listening to Yule. Yeah, Dennis only said a few things, and it was Yule going on. And Yule was going on. He basically was starting to fast talk and backpedal with stuff. And Dennis eventually just said, Yule, what can I do? I'm kind of being left high and dry here, man. What can we do? And then Yule kind of yelled at Dennis and he said, hey, you made a lot of money off me. And that really showed Yule's true colors. That was the total wrong answer. And that was kind of the end. That was about the end with Dennis and Yule. And it's just like, Dennis wasn't trying to make a lot of money off Yule. He's trying to save the world. And so the Yule did that was just, anyway, I understood why Dennis played that to me. And then Dennis said, last chance, Yule. And so he basically, here's the deal, Yule, you're going to sign something. Because this is where even the people that Yule worked in LA, Yule wouldn't sign anything. Yeah, he was, I don't know, crazy old man, paranoid, whatever, but he wouldn't sign anything that people could use, actually put business deals together to keep pursuing the technology. Yeah, Yule wouldn't do it. But Dennis was like, Yule, it's time to put up or shut up, man. So you need to come aboard, okay? You really need to come aboard with me and work with me so we can make something happen. Anyway, so this is like Dennis is like, this is my final plea, Yule. We gotta, is this gonna work or it's not? And you need to step up, man. Well, anyway, so he got a fax back from Yule, like the next day or something. And Yule basically demanded $5 million up front, just because, this kind of thing. Yeah, totally insane. So Yule was making these totally insane demands of Dennis. And that was it. That was it with Yule and Dennis. Yeah, so Yule finally went on his merry way. In fact, he died the next year. And again, all the Yule stories I could tell. So when he took out his Geiger counter and was finding his radioactive samples that he was going to use for the show, he told a lot of stories. Now I remember a lot of them, and one of them was he actually had a slug of uranium that he put in a glass of water for like a year. like in his house. And after a year, he drank the glass of water that had been soaking uranium in for a year. Well, he said that he was radioactive when he did that. And he said he went by a store that had TVs with somebody, and he would wave his hand in front of the TV sets and he could distort the picture. He was so hot. And Yule's thing was, well, my body would excrete it soon and all kind of stuff. Yeah, Yule sort of downplayed that. Well, I gotta wonder if his death didn't have something to do with that. And in fact, again, he was playing with nuclear stuff all the time. And then, in fact, when Yule left Dennis high and dry, Yule eventually went back to China, and then he went to Australia. And again, just sort of vagabonding the world, with Dennis's money. And anyway, and then he gets to Australia, and he had a container, the big cargo containers, 50 feet long and stuff. He had one of those big container loads that he had shipped to Australia. Yeah. And Australian customs, though, his container was radioactive. So it got held up there at customs because the container was radioactive. So anyway, I think he did die of cancer. So anyway, so yeah, the hazards of playing with radioactive material. So I don't know for sure. You'll smoke too. I think he was 76 when he died. And so anyway, the Yule stories. Yeah, so Yule was kind of in the end, kind of a crazy old man. It was, and that was kind of for me and inventors. Yule was kind of about almost the last straw with me with inventors. It's like I just saw that, yeah, Dennis had hitched his wagon to Yule and really hitched his wagon. The whole thing was working with the government stuff, and that was just a path of disaster. And so, yeah, it's just again back to I don't think those approaches will really work. I don't think so. Um, Yeah, so that was it with Yule. So he died in 98, and then you'll again, you still read about Yule on the internet, etc. A lot of that transmutation and stuff right now they call it pseudoscience and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, well, I know there was a lot of data back then. Again, he demoed it for the Department of Energy, etc. And it's a thing where if the establishment was really interested, they would have gotten to the bottom of that. And I don't know what happened to the city in China either, so I don't know. So I've read now that's still kind of a niche product. In fact, the guy, Mr. Copycat, he inhales Brown's gas. He breathes it every day or something, the health properties. So anyway, so Brown's gas is some weird stuff. And I don't know, again, whether you can do low energy nuclear reactions or not, essentially cold fusion. I don't know for sure, but there certainly were a lot of scientists, and there was data back then that that stuff really happened. So I don't know. My guess has been it's just another cover up, be my guess. So the guys who manage nuclear waste can keep making trillions of dollars managing nuclear waste. And again, literally when we spoke with those hearings, at that time, the estimated price tag for America's nuclear waste problem was $1 trillion. So that's what the DOA guy was talking about. There are people who are going to make $1 trillion off of this. And so if your answer doesn't make them $1 trillion, you're not going to get anywhere with this. So that's it. Another captured regulatory agency. So admitted by the guy who put on the hearings. So not a terrible surprise in retrospect. Yeah. So anyway, so that was what I have to say about Yule. I have a lot more to say about my days with Dennis. Almost went to prison for my trouble that time, and some other educational experiences. And I'll get to those in the coming posts. So that's all for now. Bye.